All right, well, I'm going to jump right in here, and my topic, of course, is Wicca witchcraft as part of paganism. Some things to know that are important. Wicca and witchcraft are not centralized, okay? And it's not a monolithic type religion. So you're going to have a lot of disparities in beliefs, and you can't expect all people in Wicca and witchcraft to believe the same thing. And I'm going to go over in a few minutes the two words, Wicca versus witchcraft. There's really so much to talk about, and it all overlaps, so it's very hard to separate the strands out. So some of this will be repetitive out of necessity. And I'm going to sometimes use the word Wicca and sometimes witchcraft. I'm going to use them sort of interchangeably, although those terms are not always equated with each other by their followers. And there are always evolving forms of Wicca and witchcraft, numerous forms, because, like I say, there's no centralized authority. So you're going to find a lot of variety. There are a lot of myths and misunderstandings about Wicca and witchcraft. It's very common for people to think things about them that are not true. This comes from the entertainment industry. The early founders of the modern witchcraft movement themselves. Elaborate tales that come from the European Inquisition, a lot of which were false, and dubious internet data. Let me warn you about getting information on the occult and or Wicca online. A lot of what I see is just outright inaccurate. It's just totally inaccurate. So, it's hard to say how to determine that. Maybe after the talk today it'll help you. But anything that's really over the top and sensational should be questioned. Anything that focuses on demons or that talks about witches having supernatural powers, you need to really be careful. And there are people who claim to have been witches or Satanists who have not been witches or Satanists. I actually know one by name who's very popular on Facebook. So you need to be careful. Don't just take people at their word because they say they were in witchcraft. I can usually tell by the language they're using and what they're saying, but most people can't, so you need to be careful. So this is kind of a warning there, because as Christians, since we are ambassadors for Christ, who's the way, the truth, and the life, we do not want to present false information about anybody, whether they're a Wiccan or a New Ager or a Mormon or whatever. We don't want to present false information about their beliefs. We want to be accurate, or it hurts our witness for Christ. Okay, now, witchcraft and Wicca are a subset of neo-paganism. Neo-paganism is the umbrella term, and it covers witchcraft, Wicca, modern Druidry, the worship of Norse and Germanic gods in their branches called Asatru and Odinism. Odinism is named after the Norse god Odin, O-D-I-N, which I think was the god the Vikings worshipped. The worship of ancient Greek and Roman gods. Italian witchcraft, which is called Strega, and a number of other modern neo-pagan movements. So this is a big, large, broad movement. Neo-paganism itself focuses on the earth and nature and includes belief in polytheism, which is the belief in many gods, seasonal rituals honoring nature and moon phases, and some worship the goddess, not all, and occult practices such as casting spells and the practice of divination. And nature is the model. Nature is the role model for everything. Witches and Wiccans are pagans or neo-pagans. Now, some people will use the word pagan, and I tend to use neo-pagan because pagan is a very broad, generic term, and neo-pagan's a little more specific and has to do with what I'm talking about. But not all neo-pagans are witches or Wiccans. Wicca is also categorized sometimes as a subdivision of witchcraft. Now we're going to get to the word witchcraft. We have to really parse all of this very carefully. So I hope this doesn't sound like I'm being picky, but I just want to be accurate. Words in the Bible that are translated as witchcraft come from Hebrew and Greek words that refer to sorcery, enchantment, or divination, and not to the modern concept of witchcraft as a religion, because witchcraft as a religion did not exist then. And actually, the word witchcraft is a modern word. It's not an ancient word. So even though a lot of Bibles will use the word witchcraft, sometimes they'll use the word divination. I think in some Bibles, for example, when Saul goes to the witch of Endor to ask her to call up Samuel. You all know that story, right? Or that account, or at least a lot of you probably know it. Some Bibles will say the witch of Endor, and some Bibles won't say they won't use the word witch. So it depends. The different versions will use different words, and that's because the witchcraft word comes from different words in Hebrew. Okay, I hope that wasn't too confusing. Basically, think of the word, when you see it in the Bible, think of it as referring to somebody who's practicing one or more of the occult arts. And by the way, all the practices of the occult are listed in Deuteronomy 18, 10 through 14, mainly 10 through 12. All of the practices are listed there: casting spells, divinations, consulting the dead, etc., reading omens. It's all listed there. And there again, in different Bible translations, you'll find different terms. And it's not because one translation is more correct than another. It's because you can actually render the Hebrew words differently, because the concepts are the same, but the words aren't always translate one-on-one. Okay. The generic term witchcraft can just refer to occult practices and folk magic. So sometimes when you read articles about, for example, witches in Africa, they talk about witchcraft in Africa. They're talking about more a folk religion. It involves usually contact with spirits and occult practices, but they're not like the witches that you would meet in the United States who call themselves witches. It's two different categories. Wicca is a modern term, and supposedly it means the modern religion of witchcraft, and it was founded by a man named Gerald Gardner, who lived 1884 to 1964. He was from England, and he started the modern religion. He claimed he was initiated into the coven by a woman in the New Forest area of England, but there is absolutely no authentication for that. In other words, he's claimed it, but nobody else knows for sure if it's true. Some people don't think that really happened. Wicca is allegedly an Old English term for witch, which originally meant to bend, B-E-N-D, as in the use of magic to alter reality. Bend, so you bend reality. Although there's a dispute about the word's origin, and some think it comes from a word meaning wise. All right, here are some influences on Gardner. Margaret Murray, 1863 to 1963. She was an Egyptologist, a folklorist, an archaeologist, and an anthropologist. Most of her works on witchcraft have been discredited. discredited. She's not a good source. There's a controversial 1899 work called Ariata, or the Gospel of the Witches, by a folklorist, very well-known folklorist named Charles Leland. And it's controversial because not everyone thinks that he was writing about authentic things. James Fraser's The Golden Bough, which is very well known as a work on occult esoterica and pagan practices, first published in 1922. I still see references to the Golden Bough. I heard about it when I was in the New Age. I even looked at a copy. I was thinking of buying it. It's referred to by some people in the New Age and the occult. I was in the New Age for about 20 years, by the way, and my testimony is on my website in case you want to know about that, about how the Lord brought me out of the New Age. And I should mention this, I should have said this earlier. I was a professional astrologer, and a lot of my clients were Wiccans and witches. And that's how I got to know a lot of Wiccans and witches, because they were my astrological clients. And some of them were friends, and my chiropractor was a witch. And because I was such good friends with them and they liked me as an astrologer, I was often invited to, I went to a few rituals that they opened. Like a lot of their rituals, they won't let you come unless you are part of their group or unless you are a Wiccan or a witch. But sometimes they will let non-Wiccans and non-witches, if they trust you, come to their rituals. So I went to some rituals, and I even went on a retreat that was held by a Wiccan group, and I was the only, my husband and my son and I were there. We were the only non-Wiccans. So I wanted you to know that I've had one-on-one personal contact with Wiccans and witches. And since I became a Christian, I've had some too in my ministry. I've had a lot. So I'm not just talking about this as something I kind of intellectually know about, but something I know about from experience and from knowing the people. Okay, that was a little interlude there. I want to say James Fraser's Golden Bough has largely been discredited. Okay, discredited. The 1948 book by Robert Graves called The White Goddess, these are all influences on Gerald Gardner and the modern religion of witchcraft. Then ceremonial magician and occultist Aleister Crowley, very infamous character, 1875 to 1947. Notice the dates of most of these people is kind of late. These aren't people from a real long time ago. These are people, some of whom lived within the lifetimes of some of us, and you'll see later there's more of them. Crowley is often called a Satanist, but he was not a Satanist. And when I see him referred to as a Satanist, I know the person doesn't really know. Either doesn't know what Satanism is, or they haven't really researched. Crowley was not a Satanist, okay? He did a lot of very immoral things, and he was into magic and the occult and contacting spirits, but he was not a Satanist. In the 1960s, there was a man named Alex Sanders who was a follower of Gerald Gardner, and he started his own witchcraft group. His date's 1926 to 1988, known as Alexandrian Wicca, and this still exists today. There are followers of Alexandrian Wicca. There are followers of Gerald Gardner, Gardnerian Wicca. Those are the two main branches of Wicca. The seed for Wicca in the United States was planted by Raymond Buckland, born 1934. Raymond Buckland is still alive. I just checked on the internet yesterday. He's still around, and in fact, I think he has a website and he's doing tours. So he's still very active. He came to the United States from England in 1963 and started Wicca here. Now, there's no historical evidence for an ancient religion of witchcraft. Witches will often tell you that witchcraft is the oldest religion in the world, but that's not true. It's actually a pretty modern religion. So just for you to be aware of that, but many people claim that. There's different branches of Wicca and witchcraft, like classical, familial, immigrant, ethnic, feminist, natural, eclectic, Dianic, which is followers of the goddess Diana, green witchcraft, which is very focused on nature and ecology, neo-shamanic, which is shamanism, hedge witchcraft, which I think focuses on spells and magic, and fairy witchcraft, which is a whole branch. Now, there are people who will be in these groups, and that's what they're really into. And these groups are not the same. So there's are you realizing there's a lot more variety than maybe you thought? Is that kind of news? Yeah, most people aren't aware of all these groups. There is no monolithic organization or central authority, and there's no stated creed of beliefs or dogma. Now we're going to go into Gerald Gardner a little bit more. He wrote something called the Book of Shadows, and this is supposedly the guide and instructions for the Wiccan rituals. He used a lot of material from a Wiccan named Doreen Valiente, and her dates are 1922 to 1999. See, it's not all that long ago to me that she died. She contributed a lot and later was very angry that he used what she wrote and she didn't really get recognized for it. And there was a split between them. His work was challenged by many people who claimed that he was using modern writings for the rituals, whereas he was claiming he was using ancient practices. There's no definitive Book of Shadows. Each Wiccan group or individual will write their own Book of Shadows. A Book of Shadows is how to do the rituals and the spells. And even individual Wiccans can keep their own Book of Shadows and write down their spells. There are solitary witches who do not belong to a coven or a group. They practice on their own. Now, here's some more people in the world of witchcraft that are very influential. There's a married couple, Stuart and Janet Farrar. F-A-R-R, well, you see it on the screen there. Stuart Farrar died in 2000. Janet Farrar is still alive. They wrote a book called A Witch's Bible, which is very popular and influenced modern-day witchcraft. Then there's also Wiccan teacher and writer Starhawk, born 1951, still alive, still very active. Her real name is Miriam Simos. S-I-M-O-S is the last name. She's extremely active and very well known. Every witch and Wiccan and even New Agers know about Starhawk. Then Margot Adler, who was an NPR personality. How many of you have heard of Margot Adler? There's a few hands here. If you listened at all in the past to NPR, National Public Radio, she was a broadcaster on there. Margot Adler's dates are 1946 to 2014. She died just 3 years ago. There were long obituaries on her when she died. She's a teacher and popular author, Scott Cunningham, 1956 to 1993. You see how recent these dates are. And these are the influential people on modern witchcraft. And then Wiccan high priestess Selena Fox, who I actually met at a conference, at a New Age conference in Oregon. Selena Fox was born in 1949, and she's still alive. She's on YouTube. It's easy to find videos of her teaching. And she founded a group in Wisconsin that's still very active, Circle Sanctuary. Now, some of these people here, Starhawk in particular, is very, very politically active in ecology and environmental causes and left political causes. Some Wiccans and witches do not like that. They don't either believe in being politically active, or they don't like it when a prominent witch or Wiccan is politically active, because they don't want to necessarily be identified with those causes. So there's a split in Wicca and witchcraft sometimes over this political activity, and some Wiccans and witches do not like Starhawk because of that, and some people love her because of that. So it really varies. Then here's some more people. Z Budapest. She calls herself, her name is really Susanna, and it starts with a Z. And she was born in 1940, still alive. She's the founder of the first documented woman-only coven oriented to goddess worship. She started this goddess worship coven, and it's called Dianic Wicca. And Dianic comes from the Greek goddess Diana. And so there are worshipers of Diana. It's very feminist-oriented. And then another influence is Dion Fortune, who died in 1946. Now, Dion Fortune was not a witch, but was an occultist and practitioner of ceremonial magic, whose books influenced witchcraft. All right, now I'm going back to Starhawk for a second. She wrote a book called The Spiral Dance. This is a very famous book in the witchcraft, Wiccan, and New Age community. Almost everybody involved in those areas knows about this book. I've read the book. This is the famous book on modern witchcraft. It's considered a key source for the practices, witchcraft practices, and goddess worship. This is about goddess worship. Many Wiccans refer to Wicca as the craft, or the old religion, okay? It can also be referred to as an earth religion or earth spirituality, and non-Wiccans and witches may use that term. The Unitarian Church, several years ago, I think in the late 90s, decided to invite followers of Wicca and witchcraft and neo-paganism into their church, and they set up this group in their church, and they called this the followers of Earth Religions, and it still exists. The initials for it are CUUPS, but I can't remember what it stands for. I think the UU is Unitarian Universalist, and a P is pagan, I think, but I'm not sure. But you could Google and find out. So CUUPS. That's in the Unitarian Church. Now, Wiccans may use the term Wiccan or witch for themselves. Those who follow Wicca may reject the terms witch or witchcraft, since they consider the term witchcraft to be connected to black magic or casting evil spells, or they're worried that other people will think that's what they do. So some people prefer to say they're Wiccan and not a witch. But then there's witches who think that's the correct term, and nobody should be scared to use that, and they think that Wiccans are just fluffy witches. So in other words, they think Wiccans are lightweights, and they're doing all this stuff kind of superficially, and they're kind of happy and dreamy, and oh, it's all white magic and everything's beautiful. And so there's some witches who really look down on that, and their view towards Wicca is just, yeah, that's not real witchcraft. So you see, there's not agreement in the witchcraft community. In fact, many years ago, there was a big conference where they had Wiccans and witches together, and I can't remember the year this happened. I think actually Starhawk writes about this in her book. I think I have this in my chapter in the AIG volume. I go into this a little bit. And they had a conference where they tried to define witchcraft, and they never could. They couldn't even agree on a definition. So there you have it. That makes it hard to talk about as well. Wiccans normally perceive their religion to be white witchcraft or white magic. which is, of course, supposed to be good. But some Wiccans say that their power is neutral, and Wicca is neutral in terms of good or bad. Then many people think Wicca is Celtic witchcraft. So it's from, England, Ireland, and Scotland, and Wales. And other forms of witchcraft are different than that. So some people say, well, that's just Celtic witchcraft. Okay. Then there's some people who just practice neo-paganism, but they call themselves a witch, but they're not really part of the witchcraft community. And so some people don't care what label you use. So you see how it's, are you getting an idea here of the variety? Like, some care, some don't. Some want to use Wicca, some want to use witchcraft, some want to use pagan. I met one woman, I went into a witchcraft shop once in Southern Maryland and talked to the owner for 45 minutes. And one of her customers there who was taking a tarot reading class from her. And I started talking to her, and she said, I want to tell you right up front, I am not a witch or a Wiccan. I'm a pagan who worships the goddess. And she wanted me to be very clear on that. I was not to classify her as a Wiccan or witch. She was a pagan who worships the goddess. So some people are very adamant about the label for themselves. Doctrine is not primary. I mean, that is just not important. They're more interested in experiences and practice, and they value their Wiccan community, usually, and the wider community of neo-pagans, although there's maybe a lot of disagreement. But they don't care about, we need to have a statement of our beliefs or anything, like some religions. Because nature is sacred, rituals involve calling on spirits and hidden forces of the material creation. Nature spirits this is a quote, are guardian beings that exist in all life forms in the plant, animal, and mineral kingdoms, close quote, and they're called on in rituals. Using an inner force to cast spells or summon gods or spirits is typically not seen as supernatural, but as natural. There are 8 seasonal rituals called sabbats. These are celebrated throughout the year, and there's kind of a diagram here. It's easy to find online, too, to look this up, and it will show you. A lot of the charts are very detailed. 2 of these are the summer and winter solstices. The other 2 are the spring and summer equinoxes. And then the others are midpoints between those 4 dates, February 2nd, May 1st, August 1st, and October 31st. And those are the 4 midpoint dates. And the phases of the moon are also important, and sometimes there will be a ritual with a certain phase of the moon. Male Wiccans and witches use the same term, usually, as females. Some men are starting to use the term warlock, but the word warlock tends to have a derogatory meaning because they tend to associate that with someone who practices black magic. So that term is not always used by men who do Wicca and witchcraft, but there are some who are now kind of reclaiming the label of warlock, but to tell you the truth, I have not seen very much of it. The Wiccan Rede. Now, this is the one thing they tend to agree on. If they have any dogma, this is it. And ye harm none, do what you will. This comes straight from Gerald Gardner. So in other words, as long as you are not doing any harm, you do what you want. And most people think Gardner got this from Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley had a motto that was, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. He claimed to get this from his spirit guide. And Crowley had a spirit guide, not unusual that he had one. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Crowley really focused, he's the ritual magician I mentioned earlier. He really focused on the idea that doing magic was based on the use of your will and exerting your will over reality. And so you use tools and incantations and calling on spirits maybe to carry out this desire, but it had to be this very strong will coming from you or it wouldn't work. And that idea still exists in the idea of casting spells and in ritual magic. And ritual magic is a separate category from witchcraft. There are ritual magicians, and they have nothing to do with Wicca or witchcraft. I mean, they don't identify that way at all. So that is another category. Because they say do no harm, they say that it's a good religion. Now, the problem is going to come, as we'll see later, is that there's no way to define harm. And that's the first thing you can ask somebody. If you meet someone who's into Wicca or witchcraft or attracted to it, you can ask them, well, how do you define harm? What is your standard? What is your authority? Okay, you can go, that's a way to go. I've actually done that, and it's effective. All right, pantheism. We're going to do pantheism. We're going to do three things here. The first one's pantheism is the view that all is God or goddess, including nature and the self. So there's divine forces in everything. Then the next one is panentheism. This is a little more subtle. This is all is God or goddess, and God and goddess is contained in all. And this also allows for the goddess or the gods to transcend creation. Now, this view actually is within Christianity, not legitimately. It's not a legitimate biblical view, but there are quote-unquote Christian panentheists, and there are popular writers who express it, I think, without realizing it, and I am not shy about naming names, and I did this at the women's conference. One of the writers that I saw this in is Anne Vaucamp, 10,000 Gifts, or 1,000 Gifts. Anne Vaucamp's 1,000 Gifts, a very, very popular book among Christian women. And I did a whole article on her on my website, and one of this, I focused on two areas of her book. One was the erotic language about God, which I find very dishonoring to God, and the other was her panentheism. So if you're interested in seeing what I have to say, that's kind of off topic, but I just think I should point out this is something to be alert about in the Christian church as well. Then there's duotheism, which is the belief in two gods commonly found in Wicca. All right, so normally in Wicca, it's the goddess and her consort, who is a male god. They're often referred to as the Lord and the Lady. And here you see a representation of them. Of course, there are many representations, but this is a common one here. A lot of Wiccans have individual altars, and they'll have something representing the Lord and the Lady on their altar. And then polytheism is the belief there are many gods, or many gods and goddesses are the manifestations of one god. The goddess may be considered to be the earth itself. So a lot of Wiccans or witches will say, the earth is the goddess, and she gave us life. And this is one reason they're so, some of them are very activists in environmental causes. And because they really truly revere nature as the goddess. And do you know a movie? Can you think of a movie that came out not too long ago where you can see this? A very popular movie. Yeah, Avatar, right. Somebody over there said it. You get the virtual gold star. Avatar, made by James Cameron. It's a very pagan movie. How many of you saw it? I'm just curious. I love to ask questions and get in it. It's okay if you saw it. I saw it, okay. Quite a few people here, maybe about 30% at least. I have an article, by the way, on it. On my articles page, I have it divided up, and I have a section called Movie Evaluations, and it's under that. There's blatant goddess worship towards the end, and I even think there's symbology in the movie that shows Christianity submitting to goddess worship, because one of the characters is named Grace, and I think she represents Christianity. I have all this in my article. Absolutely one of the most blatant pagan goddess movies I've seen in modern times. The goddess may be considered to be the earth, okay, and sometimes known as the Great Mother or Queen of Heaven, all right? Sometimes those titles are used. And because of this goddess worship, by some Wiccans and some witches, not all, just some, it's a very feminist, especially those who worship the goddess, it's a very feminist-oriented religion. And I remember when Wicca was getting popular among teenagers, partly due to a movie called The Craft that came out around, I think, 1997, 1998, very popular with teenage girls. And then a book that came out called Teen Witch, written by a woman who's a witch in Pennsylvania. It sold so well that the bookstores couldn't keep it on the shelves. I think that came out around 1998. I had teenage girls tell me that the reason they got into witchcraft was because it empowered them as women and because they loved nature. Those were the two main draws. So those are good things to know. That's what draws some women to this area. The consort of the goddess is usually referred to as the horned god, who is the male principle of the creative force, sometimes identified with the mythical god Pan, okay, the Greek god Pan, P-A-N. The horns that he usually has are male symbols. The god is a hunter with earthly passions, representing the untamed woods and wildlife. Pan is very wild and unpredictable and can even be cruel. Although I don't know they would use the word cruel. I want to stop here for a second and briefly discuss the difference. I don't think this is on the PowerPoint. The difference between the occult and Wicca and witchcraft and the New Age, because even though there's a lot of overlapping, in Wicca and witchcraft, it's very oriented towards the material world in terms of nature. It's very oriented towards nature. It's more oriented towards the pleasures of the body, sensuality, and sexuality. New Age is oriented towards the spirit and all things that they consider spiritual. So New Agers tend to be focused on this idea of the spirit over matter. It's very Gnostic. They make a division between spirit and matter. And they're also future-oriented. They're very consumed with the idea of spiritually evolving, trying to make spiritual progress. You don't find this that often among Wicca and witchcraft. People who are really following the ideas of Wicca and witchcraft and are not incorporating New Age ideas are focused on the here and now, using what they have now, working with nature now, having a relationship with the goddess or the gods now, even though they believe sometimes in a future, not always. So there is this different focus in the two. And having said that, I want to say there are Wiccans and witches who also incorporate New Age views, so they may have both. So it's not always delineated that way among people, but theoretically you can make that delineation between the two philosophies. Okay, let's see. I have to find where it was. Okay, now here we go. Some think the goddess and the gods are actual beings or forces of creation. Others think it's the inner goddess or the inner god. It's my inner spirit is the goddess, or I have the goddess within, or I have the god within. Almost kind of a New Agey thing. So some of them look at it that way. Still others see the gods as psychological metaphors or illustrative of nature's powers. So you have different views of who the gods and goddesses are and how real they are. I don't think most think they're actual personal beings. Some do, but I don't think that's as common. Many Wiccans revere what is known as the triple goddess. And the triple goddess is maiden or virgin, mother, and crone, the three aspects of the goddess and feminine nature, and that corresponds to the new moon, the full moon, and the waning moon. So the symbols for these, the triple goddess will often be the symbol of the new, you can see it there. There's a new moon, then a full moon with a circle, and then another half circle on the other side. That's a waning moon. So there you see the moon, the importance of the moon phases, and often related to the triple goddess. And some of them will say the Trinity is a copy of the triple goddess, because of course they'll say witchcraft is older than Christianity. All right, now a number of Wiccans and witches are non-theists. That means they don't say there's no God, but they also don't say there's a God. But they also aren't saying we can't know, which is agnostic. Now, some of them might be agnostic, but it's more that they're a non-theist. They just won't say, well, there's a God. No, there is no God. And this is actually like Buddhism. Buddhism is a non-theist religion. I was very much into Zen Buddhism. That doesn't really acknowledge a God, but it doesn't deny a God. Or there are Wiccans and witches who are atheists, and they just say there is no God at all, or no goddess. So the goddess to them is more a symbol, or it's a natural force, or it's part of who they are, or something like that. But a lot of them will also say when you die, that's it, you go back to the earth, and that's the end. Just like what a lot of atheists say. Their view of Christianity, they believe the Christian God is patriarchal and oppressive to women. They see the Bible as a work of men and kind of men who were prejudiced against women. And they see Christianity as organized religion. It's based on following rules. It's unjust to minorities, and it's patriarchal. These are very common views. Jesus is a symbol of Christian oppression, of witchcraft, and of women. Or some believe, these are different views of Jesus. He was an enlightened spiritual teacher. That's also a New Age view. Some of them will incorporate Jesus into their pantheon of gods and goddesses. And there is something called Christian Wicca. And I have talked to followers of Christian Wicca, and they will say they're Christian and they're Wiccan. But of course what they do is they take what they see as the ethical teachings of Jesus and they combine them with Wicca. They're more Wiccan than, they're not really Christian, but they will use that term. And there's a whole branch called Christian Wicca. Satan is an invention of the Christian church to scare people and keep them subjugated. And now I want to say a word about Satanism and Wicca and witchcraft. They're two separate, totally separate things. And I think you have a speaker at the conference on Satanism, so I won't say too much about it. But they are separate, and actually they don't like each other. The Wiccans and witches don't like Satanists because they think they stole their symbol, the pentagram. And the Satanists don't like Wiccans because they think they're a fluffy white light religion. So white light religion means that you believe in being good. And Satanists look down on that, and they will classify Christians and Wiccans as white light religions. So Satanists have a very different attitude towards things than Wiccans and witches. It's a whole different mindset. But there is the pentagram, which is the most common symbol of witch, and there you see it. Now you see the point is up. When it's Satanism, it's turned upside down, and it's 2 points up. And the reason for that is because this top point there is spirit. And so you see where this is how the Wiccans see it. It's spirit, And then the other 4 points are the 4 elements: air, earth, water, fire. But the Satanists say, no, we put the material world above the spirit, because we're here to enjoy life and do our will and indulge our passions. You know, it's all about indulging self. So the material world is above. It's not about being spiritual or being good. Now, that's the Satanist view. So they tend to use the pentagram the other way. Now, there are some witches who use the pentagram the same way as the Satanists for their own reasons, but they're not Satanists. So, okay, so there's some difference in the use of the pentagram and its meaning. There's other symbols that they use, the Ankh. Here's the union of male and female, used from Egypt, the worship of Isis. There's the crescent moon, which often relates to the goddess and those phases of the moon. Crystals are believed to have healing and spiritual properties, and often worn as jewelry on clothes or carried in small pouches. Now, this also applies to New Agers. Crystals are as popular, if not more popular, in the New Age than they are in witchcraft. Common practices: meditation, visualization, where you visualize something to make it happen. Now, that's used in magic and casting spells to visualize it. Invocation is calling on the gods, goddesses, spirits, or nature gods, calling on the 4 directions of north, south, east, west. I've actually been in a circle that did where we called on the 4 directions, even though I was never a Wiccan or a witch. But as I said, I participated in some of these rituals. Now, this is done for rituals, and you also do chanting, burning candles. Burning candles can be done for meditation and or practicing magic. And there are certain things that you do with the candle when you do the ritual and magic. They view magic and power as neutral, and what counts is the intentions of the Wiccan in the use of such magic. That's where good and evil lie, is in your intentions. Most of them agree with Aleister Crowley's definition of magic: the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity to the will. So I mentioned this earlier. It's about imposing your will on reality. Magic is done in the context of rituals and invoking power. Usually it's seen as a natural force, not supernatural. Different forms of ritual. They also do divination techniques like tarot cards, astrology, the I Ching, psychic readings, etc. So I have an article on divination on my website where I go more into all the kinds of divination. Many Wiccans and witches are initiated into a coven, a group of witches, usually 13 people, but not always, and after a year and a day of study. But some people who practice by themselves initiate themselves in their own ceremony. Okay, and I already mentioned ritual magicians. There's no absolute good or evil, although sometimes they believe in the law of 3, which is whatever you do comes back to you threefold. They also believe, now this is important to understand, polarity. Okay, this is having to do with the view of good and evil. And I'm going to quote something that Janet and Stuart Farrar wrote in A Witch's Bible. The theory of polarity maintains that all activity, all manifestation arises from and is inconceivable without the interaction of pairs and complementary opposites, and that this polarity is not a conflict between good and evil, but a creative tension like that between positive and negative terminals of an electric battery. Good and evil only rise with the constructive or destructive application of the polarity's output. So that's their definition in A Witch's Bible. This is very common, and they use the yin-yang symbol to symbolize that, which is actually very appropriate, because the yin-yang symbol, which is from the Chinese religion Taoism, is not about good and evil. It's about opposites being part of the one whole, and they're actually they merge with each other and become each other, and there's a creative, or there's a tension between them that's actually considered good. And so this is how they view good and evil. The witches, how they view it. An all-good creator is static. Good cannot exist without evil. You can't have the yin-yang symbol all white or all black. Okay, so they need each other. Even the goddess and the gods are said to have a dark side. And then they do believe sometimes there can be evil spirits or dark spirits, but there's no real definition or understanding of this. And there's no final judgment on your actions, and certainly not a judgment from a divine source. As far as evolution goes, they don't have any, you're not really going to find any kind of belief for or against this. Some of the atheistic witches who might be scientifically oriented might believe in evolution, but a lot of them believe in creation myths from various pagan religions, like the Greeks or other pagan beliefs. And some say there's a cycle, and this is a very common belief around the world. There's a larger cycle that will end and then repeat, like among the Mayans. The whole thing about the Mayan year that happened a few years ago, it wasn't about the end of the world, it was about the end of a cycle. And then another cycle starts. And the Mayans had a very complicated map of their cycles. I have an article on that on my website too. Death is seen as part of life and is neutral. It's not bad or evil. And it's even seen as good sometimes, or a healing. Time is seen as in a series of cycles, and reincarnation is popular, but not universal. Summerland, some of them believe there's a place called Summerland where the dead are reunited with their dead loved ones and in a beautiful place. This is also an idea in Theosophy, which I don't have time to explain, but an occult group started in the 1800s that influenced the New Age. And spiritualism, the religion of contacting the dead. They're spiritualist churches. I've been to them. So you have a variety of views here about what happens after death. Of course, the agnostic and atheist witches and non-theist witches may believe nothing happens after death. They reject the concept of sin. Okay, this is the same as in the New Age. You're here to learn lessons, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have anything to do with sin. Of course, in the Bible, good and evil are taught very clearly. In the Old Testament and the New Testament, God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. 1 John 1:5. Another passage would be 1 Timothy 6:16. Okay? And of course, throughout the Bible, God is the standard for good. He is the standard for morality. And there is a very clear dividing line between good and evil. Satan is real. Okay, they don't believe Satan is real, the witches don't. The concept of polarity about good and evil is against what we know. For example, Romans 12:21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And also another passage, I'm throwing these out kind of fast, Isaiah 5:22. I'm whipping through the end here. Death is a result of sin. Now, this is another area you can talk about with a witch or Wiccan. It's the result of sin due to man's disobedience. We're all born separated from God, and death is called the enemy in 1 Corinthians 15:26. That's a verse I quote a lot to New Agers and to Wiccans. It's the enemy. It's not what God wanted. It's not a good thing. And death will be thrown into the lake of fire, Revelation 20:14. So those two verses on death are good to know. And how about do no harm? Well, what standard are you going to use? And one time I was talking, I was invited to speak at this college in Southern Maryland, it was a state college, part of the University of Maryland system. I was invited by InterVarsity to speak, and they had me there because the pagan student union was very large, and the Christians didn't really know, well, how do we interact with these pagans? So they wanted me to come speak. And so what I did was I did a talk on the misunderstandings of Christianity and the misunderstandings of paganism. And I went through each, and I was able to give the gospel and the Christianity. And the pagans came, and they included witches and, Wiccans, goddess worshippers, neo-pagans. And I asked them during the talk, because they were all kind of sitting together, and I knew I had talked to a couple of them, and the president of the Pagan Student Union was there. So I asked them, what if you were in India and you were in a small village where they still practice widow burning, where they put the live widow on the funeral pyre of her husband? Would that be a bad thing? Oh, they did think that was a bad thing. And I said, well, why? Well, that's wrong to throw a live person on the funeral. I said, but what if that's their belief? And they have some kind of reason behind that it's helpful, maybe even, for the widow. So who are you to say that's wrong? Because they don't think that's doing harm. Now see, they don't really have a response to that because they don't have any standard for good and evil. I think this is a good approach really with anybody who's a relativist. But anyway, I've had this dialogue before, and I think what you want to do is get people to think about their belief. How do you apply that in the real world? That's the kind of approach you want to go to, so they can see it for themselves. All right, they may say the Bible doesn't condemn witchcraft. And actually it doesn't condemn witchcraft because there's no word for witchcraft in Hebrew or Greek. And of course it can't condemn the modern religion of witchcraft because it didn't exist then. But it does condemn sorcery, divination, and the worship of false gods. So, that's the angle to go in, not the Bible says witchcraft is wrong. I never say that, because a lot of them know that word isn't really there. They say they're practicing white magic, but there's no such thing as white magic. Magic is magic. When you're doing magic, it's actually in the list I mentioned earlier, Deuteronomy 18:10 through 12. That passage condemns those practices because those practices were related to the worship of false gods. And that's still true today. So it's honoring false gods, or the actually fallen angels who can mimic gods or whatever, fallen angels. Witches and Wiccans may say the original religion was the goddess, and Christianity suppressed this because it's patriarchal. Now there's a couple of answers to this. One is many modern scholars have recognized that there is no matriarchal prehistory. In fact, there's a book called The Myth of Matriarchal Prehistory, written by a woman. It's a secular book who teaches in Boston, named Cynthia Eller, E-L-L-E-R. And she is a feminist, but she said, when feminists or Wiccans or witches try to say there was a matriarchal prehistory, they're doing harm because this isn't true. And it's interesting because she's actually not against that idea, but she's trying to show it's not true, in other words. The other thing is, actually goddesses were consorts or counterparts of male gods in history. They're always the consorts or counterparts to male gods. Also, in the Bible, when you look at the New Testament and you see how Jesus treated women, he treated them as equals. Who found the empty tomb? Who found it first? Women. Who did he appear to first? Women. And at that time, having women as witnesses was not considered a good thing. Because culturally, a man should be a witness. It gives it more credibility. And yet God had it planned out for the women to be the witnesses. So if they really wanted to try to make Christianity look better, they would have had men that he appeared to first. But he appeared to women. They went and told the men. This is very countercultural. And it's very feminist. If you look at feminism as valuing women as equal to men. And so I point this out. Another great example of this is Jesus talking to the woman at the well in John 4. I went through that passage with a 15-year-old girl who was in witchcraft and was scared. It shows Jesus' tenderness with this woman, even though she was living with this man, not her husband, and had gone through 5 men. I mean, she must have been, considered by the village, probably hardly anyone talked to her. And here's Jesus, who's a rabbi, and he's not even supposed to talk to a woman like this. And he's not only talking to her, he's showing her compassion and revealing who he is. This is incredible. If you really think about the times and the culture that this happened in, this is an incredible account of Jesus with this woman. It's just amazing to me. I still get awestruck by it. And so the New Testament, women were treated much better in the church than they were in the culture that they lived in, whether Jewish or Greek or Roman. So women weren't treated highly in the Greek culture at all. So the Bible actually values women. And Jesus valued women. This is a point to remember when you're talking to a feminist unbeliever, whether they're a New Age or Wiccan or just a secular feminist. Okay, they usually don't know the true gospel. They just talk about organized religions, so you need to talk about that. Well, what do you think Christianity is? Or ask them, what is your background? And they may say, well, I was a Christian, or I was raised in church. Okay, find out first what they mean by that, because somebody told me that one time, and I said, what church was it? And he said, Jehovah's Witnesses. And I said, well, that's not actually Christian, so no wonder you don't have, your understanding may be a little bit skewed. So find out first it was really Christian, at least in name, and then find, why did you leave that? What was wrong? Well, it was just a bunch of rules. It might have been very legalistic. I wasn't allowed to wear makeup, or I couldn't listen to rock music, or, I couldn't do this, I couldn't do that. And they think it's all these rules, and, you have to follow all these rules to get to heaven and be good. So you find out what turned you off from Christianity, or what do you think of Christianity, and usually what they say is totally inaccurate. So you can say, well, no, that's not really true. Can I tell you what it really is? Okay, and talk about Jesus. Don't quote the Bible. Don't say, well, in John 14:7, don't do that, because it sounds like you're showing off. Just say, well, Jesus said this. I was talking to a Wiccan once, and I said, why do you think Jesus came? And she said, well, he came to show love. Because she had this good view of Jesus. And I said, yes, he did. And I said, but he also said he came to save sinners. And she said, no, I don't think he said that. I said, yeah, he did. And I showed her where he said it. Okay, so that's another approach, a suggestion I'm giving you. So they don't know the true gospel. Usually they don't, or they don't understand it. Always see a Wiccan as a person made in the image of God, and don't see them as a Wiccan or a witch first. See them as a person made in the image of God. And ask the Lord to give you love and compassion for that person so that you'll share the truth in love. And don't get angry and argumentative. Ask them what drew them to Wicca. Why do they like it? And just listen to what they say. Ask about their spiritual background. I already said that. Ask them to think about their ideas. Don't use, terms like atonement, redemption, and justification. Unless they're familiar for some reason with those terms, don't use those terms, because they don't understand them, or it sounds like you're showing off again. You can explain what they are, but try not to use the term. Have no fear in talking to witches. There's no reason to be afraid at all. We're not supposed to be afraid of sharing the gospel with anybody. That goes for a Satanist. Okay. Don't try to prove they're wrong. Instead, try to discuss the nature of God and Jesus, especially Jesus' power over nature, demons, and illness in the Gospels. And you can see, for example, in Matthew, when you go from like Matthew, I think it's 6, 7, and 8, or 7, 8, and 9, you see all of that narrated there. You have Jesus' power over demons, over nature, over illness, all blah, 1, 2, 3, right down the line in accounts there. In fact, I was saved reading a portion of Matthew 8. That's when I was born again. I was reading about Jesus rebuking the sea and the wind. Don't hesitate to stand on the truths of Scripture. Don't be wishy-washy. Okay, if they ask you about hell, don't be wishy-washy. They don't respect it if you're wishy-washy. They won't respect you. Let them see Jesus' love. And here's a mini gospel, and then it's going to be over. And thank you for letting me go on 20 minutes. Jesus is the Son of God who came to earth as man to live a perfect life in complete obedience to God, because none of us can do that. We are born with a desire to do our will, not God's will, and we do things every day opposed to God. This is called sin, and it leads eventually to dissatisfaction and despair. The ultimate penalty for sin is death, which is eternal separation from God. That's what death really is, biblically. But since Jesus lived the perfect life, he was able to pay for that penalty when he died on the cross. He bodily rose the third day, conquering death, which is an enemy. By believing in who Jesus is, and that there is nothing you can do to pay for your own opposition to the one true God, you are forgiven of all your sins and have eternal life. Thank you so much. I went on, and I appreciate your patience, and I'll be up here for questions. Thank you.